Olga from Minerva, and this video is a sew-along for the McCall's 8139 pattern. This is the pattern we will be using today, and it is for a really nice shirt dress. I'm really excited about this because it is kind of retro, kind of vintagey, has these like cool vibes. It's not officially part of their vintage collection, but it does have this like vibe, and I'm very excited about that. I think it would look really, really cool with a variety of fabrics, so you can have a lot of fun here. And it's one of those patterns that's really versatile because even though you don't have that many views, you have 3 views in this pattern. We'll be making view A. You can, with fabric, you can make a world of dresses and so many different variations on this. The other very exciting thing about this project will be fabric, of course. I have this beautiful fabric here, which is the heavy stretch cotton sateen fabric in the color sand. I have about 2 meters of this. This is a kind of heavier weight cotton that has a little stretch to it. It's not super stretchy, but it does have a little stretch to it, which means that it will be really comfortable but also hold its shape, which is perfect for this kind of shirt dress. And this color sand, it just looks to me as if I am going on a safari in the 40s, and I love that. I will have everything linked below as always for you to check out so we can sew together. As for notions and other things we will be needing for this project, we have some interfacing. This is the Vliezline. This is their soft and light iron-on in white. This is about 90 by 50, so if you want, you can buy this by the meter, but this is a nice little concise amount if you don't need that much. Next, we are using some coordinating thread. This is the Gutermann 100% polyester thread in color 854. And last but not least, we are using some hemline buttons. These come in little boxes of 5, so you might want to get 2 because we do need 10 buttons total. You need a button with about 1.5 centimeter diameter. So if you do have some in your stash, make sure you measure them to size. I will have everything again linked below so you can buy the same ones as me or get different colors if you like, but this way you know for sure that these products work with this pattern and that you will have everything you need. It'll be easier, you can find everything in one place. So I think that is everything we need to get started. As always, I will mention things throughout the video that are not absolutely 100% necessary, but that just help make things easier. But do know that those things can be used in a variety of projects, so they are more of like an investment to your craft room and to your sewing equipment than really something you absolutely need for this specific project. I hope that makes sense. So that is everything you will be needing for this project, so without further ado, let's go get started. The first thing we have to do is cut our pattern pieces. Make sure you check what size you need and cut accordingly. Today we are making view A, so we need to cut out pieces 1, 2, and then 4 through to 12. Some pieces have different lengths depending on which view you are making, for example the sleeves. So my advice is to simply fold them in at that mark if you are making the shorter version so that you have the option to make the other versions later on. Next, we can place our pattern pieces on the fabric to cut our fabric pieces. When you're doing this, be mindful of the fabric grain to achieve the best results. I find it useful to follow the guide on the pattern instructions, so I normally try to be really careful where the selvage is and which way my fabric is going. However, to avoid fabric wastage, you should try to get the pieces as close together as possible, and seeing as this pattern allows for seam allowance, you don't have to worry about running out of space. Once all the pattern pieces are pinned in place, we can go ahead and cut. I'm using pinking shears to cut my fabric here because these will help avoid fraying and give my garment a better finish. When all the pieces have been cut out, we will transfer any pattern markings onto our fabric. You can use a variety of methods for this, but I am using a combination of an erasable fabric pen and a carbon paper. Don't forget to cut out the small notches on your fabric, making sure to stay within the seam allowance. The last thing to do before we start sewing is to cut out and attach our interfacing piece. Use the same method you would use for cutting fabric to cut your interfacing. If this is your first time using interfacing, there is a soft side, which is the right side, and then there is a kind of textured, slightly tacky, shiny side, which is the wrong side that will actually stick to your fabric. Now, when you are cutting out and attaching this to the fabric, be very careful that you don't iron the wrong side so that it doesn't get stuck to your iron and you don't ruin your iron. Don't forget to trim the corners of the interfacing on the edge opposite the notches, and then fuse the interfacing with your iron on a loaded medium setting for about 8 seconds as the instructions state. Now that all our preparations are done, we can get to work on the bodice. Pin the darts in the bodice front using the fabric marking as a guide. Then sew these darts and press the bust dart down and the other one towards the center. Next, we will stitch the curved edges of the pockets, or piece number 2, around 1 centimeter from the raw edge using long machine stitches. This makes it easier to ease the fullness of the curves later on. Leave the ends of the thread long so they're easier to pull on later. After that, turn the upper edge of the pockets to the outside along the fold line. Stitch these ends and then trim the seam allowance. Then, turn the upper edge of the pocket to the inside and turn in the seam allowances on the remaining edges. You may pull the threads of the earlier stitches to ease the fullness of the curves. Finally, press the pockets to keep everything in place. You may also use pins to secure the pockets in place until you actually get around to ironing it, just to make sure you get the perfect shape that you want. The final step to finish preparing our pockets is to top stitch them at about 2.5 centimeters from the upper edge. To attach the pockets to the bodice, pin them in place, making sure to match the symbols. First, we will edge stitch the side and lower edges. This means we will stitch close to the finished edge or seam. Be careful around the darts to make sure you avoid any lumps or undesired tucks. Then we will top stitch the same side and lower edges about 6 millimeters from the previous stitches. Our next step is to stitch the bodice back sections together at the center back seam, making sure we match those notches. Use your pinking shears to neaten up the seam allowance and then press that seam open. After that, we can attach the yoke by pinning it to the upper edge of the back of the bodice, matching the centers and the notches. Stitch this in place, and once you've neatened the seams, press it towards the yoke. To finish the back, top stitch the yoke back over the seam allowance and then top stitch the back piece on both sides of the center back seam. The final step of our bodice is stitching the front and back together at the shoulders and sides. Make sure to match the notches, neaten the seams, and press them open. We can now get started on the skirt. First, pin the pockets to each skirt front at the upper side edge. Stitch that in place and trim the seam allowance. Next, turn the pocket to the inside and top stitch the upper side edge. After that, pin the skirt side front to each pocket at the outer edge, keeping the front free and making sure to match the notches. Then, stitch and neaten these seams. Finally, baste the upper and side edges together. I like to use some contrasting thread so I can see it more clearly later when I need to remove it. Moving on to the skirt back, Pin those darts in place and stitch them. Finish them by pressing them towards the center. Then we can stitch the skirt back sections together at the center back seam. Press the seam allowance open and top stitch the back on both sides of the center back seam, just like you did on the bodice. Now we will stitch the skirt front and back together at the sides. Make sure to match those notches. Then remove the basting stitches at the sides and neaten the seam allowance with pinking shears. Finally, press the seam allowances open. At last, we can put the dress together. With right sides together, pin the skirt to the bodice, taking care to match the notches, seams, and symbols. I find using Clover Wonder clips makes this part run a little smoother, and if you make any mistakes, it's easy to remove them and place them in the right position. Stitch the pieces together and then stitch them again in the seam allowance at 6 mm from the first stitches. Use pinking shears to trim close to the stitches and press the seam towards the bodice. For the facing, we need to turn the long edge of the front to the wrong side along the outer fold line and press it in place. I used a few pins just to keep that in place until I got my iron to make sure that I was really pressing in the fold line. After pressing, we will have to baste across the upper and lower raw edges. Now, turn the front self-facing to the outside along the remaining fold line. Here, pin the facing to the neck edge and stitch it, pivoting across the seam allowance at the large circle. Then, clip diagonally to the large circle and trim the excess fabric to form a square shape. After that, turn the front self-facing to the inside and press it in place. Then baste the inner edges of the self-facing in place, stopping at 15 centimeters above the low raw edge. Finally, baste the raw edges together at the neck edge. To get started on the collar, first we will stay stitch the neck edge of the dress. This basically means to stitch 3 millimeters from the seam line on the seam allowance. Then we are going to turn in the seam allowance on the notched edge of the uninterfaced collar piece and press it in place. After that, stitch the collar sections together, right sides together, leaving the notched edge open. Then, trim the seam allowance, being careful to cut those corners to make it less bulky when you turn the collar inside out. Turn the collar right side out, and then you may press this so it's nice and neat and stays all crisp and in place. Now, with right sides together, pin the collar to the neck edge, clipping where necessary around the neck edge of the dress. Stitch that in place, keeping the pressed edge free. Then trim that excess seam allowance. And finally, press that seam towards the collar, making sure to press on both sides to make the seam look nice and crisp and very neat. At this stage, the instructions tell you to slip stitch the pressed edge over the seam, but I found that I could just skip ahead to the next step, which is to top stitch the outer edges of the collar and then edge stitch the neck seam of the collar, which means to stitch really close to the neck edge. And finally, we can move on to the sleeves. And first, we're going to ease stitch the upper edge of the sleeve between the small circles. This is basically using a large machine stitch where you sew along that, and then you can pull the threads to ease the fabric. When we've done that, we can stitch the sleeve seam on the sides and make sure to match those notches. And as always, press the seams open and neaten them with pinking shears. Then we're going to turn up the sleeve hem. We're going to baste close to the fold and then turn in about 6 millimeters on the raw edge and baste the hem in place close to the upper edge. Then we're going to press that in place, and at last, then we will top stitch the hem along the upper basting. And when that's done, you can remove the basting stitches. Now it's finally time to attach the sleeves to the dress. So we're going to pin the sleeves into the armholes with right sides together and make sure to place the large circle at the shoulder seam. Make sure you're matching the notches because there are 2 notches on one side and 1 on the other. So that means that there is a right sleeve and a left sleeve. So make sure you match them in the correct places so you get the correct placement of your sleeves. You can adjust the ease here, and if you want, you can baste it in place. I just used pins and clover wonder clips. Then I stitched that and then stitched that again about 6 millimeters away in the seam allowance. Then I trimmed that close to the stitching and pressed the seam allowances flat and turned the seams towards the sleeves.
Then we're going to place the guide for the buttonholes on the right front, having the upper edge even with the neck seam and the long edge of the tissue even with the front edge. We're going to transfer those markings and make the buttonholes at the markings. Then we're going to lap the opening edges, making sure that they match in the center. And then we'll use the buttonholes as guides to make the button markings on the left front, and we'll sew our buttons on the markings. Now this can be different for you depending on what sewing machine you have, but my sewing machine actually allows me to sew buttons with the machine, so that makes it a lot faster and a lot easier. But if you have to sew them by hand, then you have to sew them by hand. Normally sewing machines will allow you to do this. You have to lower the little grips that make the fabric move and remove any kind of sewing foot that you have on the machine. And then using a zigzag stitch, normally at a 4mm distance, you can actually sew the buttons in place. When you're doing this, and especially if you're trying it for the first time, make sure you use your hand crank to make sure that the needle is falling into the holes of the buttons. If you don't check this, you can break a needle and break a button. So just be mindful of that. Go slow, but even going slow with this process, it's a lot faster than sewing by hand. So I definitely recommend this. When you've sewn all your buttons, you will turn over the edge of the self-facing to the outside along the second fold line. And we are going to stitch across the self-facing about 3.2 centimeters above the raw edge. And then we're going to trim that a little bit. After that, we will turn the self-facing back to the inside, and we will turn up a 3.2 centimeter hem. You can baste close to the fold and then turn the raw edge in and baste that in place, but I prefer to just use Clover Wonder clips. When that's done, we can actually stitch the hem, continuing over the front opening edges, and just remove your clips as you go, or use your basting as a guide if that's what you chose to do.
Okay, so that is our finished project. I hope you enjoyed sewing along with me and that you had fun, that you maybe learned a few techniques or learned a few things, and that you got some really cute dresses out of this. So if you do end up making this pattern with our fabrics, please share those with us. We would love to see your creations and your versions of this. We have so much fun looking at them, and it would just bring us so much joy to have a look at what you are up to. Also, if you want, you can join our website for free. You can become a member and essentially share your photos and videos and share your makes, honestly, and then you can meet other people that do this, that like the same things as you, and it's really exciting. It's really cool. You get to meet new people from all over the world who like the same things as you. You get to learn from them. You get to share ideas and share creativity, and it's just a really cool community. So if you want to join, you can do that. That is everything for this video. I hope you enjoyed sewing along with me, you had some fun, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!